Case 8. Lindsay versus the National Transportation Safety Board. We find ourselves in the U.S. Court of Appeals, D.C. Circuit, the year 1995. Let's start with the facts. We begin our sordid tale in Central Florida in the pre-dawn hours of Sunday, October 17, 1993. Two men and two women are at the Shamrock Lounge in Leesburg, drinking heavily. Their common interest is skydiving. Both men are also pilots. Neither woman is. One of the men, Philip Smith, owns an aging Cessna 182, a single-engine four-seater aircraft. He keeps his plane at Leesburg Municipal Airport. Smith is with his girlfriend, Deborah Hall, a bartender at the Shamrock. The other man, petitioner Paul Lindsay, holds an FAA ATP certificate and has logged 4,500 hours of flying time. Lindsay is with his girlfriend, Sandra Princess, a nurse who resides in a trailer in the nearby town of Umatilla. Lindsay lives with his mother some 10 miles away, but sometimes stays with Princess. They have driven to the bar together in Princess's car. It is 1:30 a.m., and the Shamrock Lounge is about to close for the evening. "It's a nice night for a flight," the men observe. With that, their reckless, irresponsible plan is hatched. Lindsay wants to pilot Smith's plane. He has flown it before. Smith decides to fly it himself. That detail settled, the four men and women leave the bar and drive in Deborah Hall's car to Leesburg Airport, 3 miles away. On the way, they stop to buy some beer. Later, reports reach the Leesburg Sheriff's Office about a plane flying erratically over the town, a plane perhaps in trouble. Officers arriving at Leesburg Airport at 2:39 a.m. discover Hall's car and piles of clothing on the ground. No one is around. The runway is dark. While the officers wait, a Cessna 182 lands. Philip Smith is in the pilot's seat and very drunk. Hall is next to him. In the back are Lindsay and Princess, both naked. The officers ask Smith to step out. He complies, promptly fails a sobriety test, and is arrested for violating Florida law. A deputy sheriff escorts Smith to his cruiser and drives him to the county jail. Other officers stay behind, interviewing Hall, Lindsay, and Princess. Hall gets out of the plane. Lindsay refuses to budge. He is loud, obnoxious, and like Smith, very drunk. He brags about his flying skills. He refuses to tell the officers his address. His girlfriend, Princess, gives them her address in Umatilla and gives the same address for Lindsay. Princess tries to persuade Lindsay to leave with her and Deborah Hall. He refuses. He tells Princess to go ahead with Hall. Lindsay promises to beat her home anyway. The officers radio the lieutenant to report Lindsay's recalcitrance. By this time, it is 4 a.m. The lieutenant radios back that Smith has given Lindsay permission to stay in his plane. Princess decides to remain with him. Hall departs in her car, apparently sufficiently recovered from the effects of alcohol. At 4:12 a.m., the officers drive out of the airport, leaving Lindsay and Princess there alone. Two of the officers park close by, hidden in the darkness, watching the airport entrance and runway, concerned that Lindsay might try to take off in Smith's plane. The officers maintain their lookout until 4:41 a.m. All is quiet, and they leave to respond to another call. About 5 a.m., a lieutenant and his deputy, having left Smith in jail, return to the Leesburg Airport. It is not yet light. The Cessna is gone. So are Lindsay and Princess. Remembering the address Princess had given them, they drive 12 miles to Umatilla. There, on the runway of the Umatilla Airport, they find Smith's plane. Princess's trailer is a few hundred yards away, across the street. The door is locked, and when the lieutenant knocks, no one answers. Later that day, the police impound the plane. These largely undisputed facts were adduced during a 2-day hearing before an administrative law judge on Lindsay's challenge to the FAA administrator's emergency order revoking his pilot certificate. FAA regulations prohibited Lindsay from recklessly operating an aircraft and from acting as a crew member of a civil aircraft within 8 hours after the consumption of any alcoholic beverage. Attorneys for both sides stipulated that the only issue at the hearing would be whether Lindsay piloted Smith's plane on its October 17 flight from Leesburg to Umatilla. The ALJ found that the FAA administrator had not proven his case. The National Transportation Safety Board reinstated the revocation on appeal. So what is the issue now? 3 of them, in fact. Whether the board erred in reversing the ALJ's decision, whether the board's decision upholding the order of revocation is supported by substantial evidence, and whether by presenting an affirmative defense, Lindsay waived any objection to the ALJ's refusal to rule in his favor at the close of the administrator's case in chief. What was the holding? Well, the court sustained the board's ruling that the ALJ misapplied the preponderance of evidence standard. As to the board's ruling that Lindsay violated the regulations, there is substantial evidence to support it. The board's decision strikes us as entirely correct, they said. Let's look at some of the reasoning in this case. Let's first start by explaining the term ALJ. An ALJ, administrative law judge, in the US is a judge and trier of fact who both presides over trials and adjudicates the claims or disputes, in other words, bench trials, involving administrative law. The US Supreme Court has recognized that the role of a federal administrative law judge is functionally comparable to that of an Article 3 judge. If you look at this little chart, the separation of powers, under Article 1, you have Congress, under Article 2, you have the executive, and under Article 3, you have the judicial branch. An ALJ's powers are often, if not generally, comparable to those of a trial judge. The ALJ may issue subpoenas, rules on proffers of evidence, regulate the course of a hearing, and make or recommend decisions. ALJs are limited as they have no power to sanction unless a statute provides that power. Now let's define the regulation 14 CFR Part 9113. This regulation prohibits operation of an aircraft in a careless or reckless manner so as to endanger the life or property of another. Let's continue now by defining the regulation 14 CFR 9117. Specifically, A1. No person may act or attempt to act as a crew member of a civil aircraft within 8 hours after the consumption of any alcoholic beverage. Next up, we shall describe the relationship between the FAA and NTSB with respect to airman enforcement action. The Enforcement Division of the FAA initiates legal enforcement actions to address non-compliance by regulated entities and persons, including Number 1, certificate actions, 2, civil penalty actions, and 3, informal procedures and settlements. These policies, procedures, and guidelines for the FAA's legal enforcement actions are contained in FAA Compliance and Enforcement Program Order 2150.3c. A little bit more detail. Certificate actions in the form of certificate suspensions and revocations against persons and entities holding FAA-issued certificates. Civil penalty actions. Under the statutory authority cited in 14 CFR 1314 or 1318, the FAA has authority to issue orders assessing a civil penalty of up to $400,000 against persons other than individuals and small business concerns, and up to $50,000 against individuals and small business concerns. Generally, though, the penalty for each violation ranges from $1,100 to $27,500, depending on the provision violated and the category of the alleged violator. And lastly, informal procedures and settlements with an FAA attorney. These are to give the alleged violator a chance to bring the FAA's attention to information favorable to it, such as exculpatory or mitigating evidence. And now let's conclude by defining the term preponderance of the evidence. This refers to the greater weight of the evidence required in a civil non-criminal lawsuit for the trier of fact, jury or judge without a jury, to decide in favor of one side or the other. This preponderance is based on the more convincing evidence and its probable truth or accuracy, and not on the amount. Preponderance of the evidence is required in a civil case and is contrasted with beyond a reasonable doubt, which is the more severe test of evidence required to convict in a criminal trial. No matter what the definition stated in various legal opinions, the meaning is somewhat subjective.